The Vikings were a highly influential group of people in the Middle Ages. Numerous forms of entertainment and media have been influenced by the fierce warriors, from TV shows to professional football teams, and even video games. The influence of the medieval Vikings is everywhere. One of the many reasons why the Vikings are known today is because of the stories of how ferocious they were and how they left ruins in their wake. The Vikings built a society based on strength and warfare, drawing parallels to the knight culture, analyzed by Karis in her book From Boys to Men. Much like the knights, the Vikings defined masculinity by bravery in battle. The men were the warriors of the Viking people and would bring riches to their villages. Their society was intolerant to weakness, and to be a man, you must possess excellent strength and courage in battle. The battlefield was the proving ground for the male warriors, and there were plenty of opportunities as the Vikings swept through Europe during the 9th century through the 11th century. The Vikings began to expand toward the end of the 8th century as the first recorded Viking raid was on the coast of modern-day England in 789. Harsh climates, short agricultural seasons, and the economic climate of Europe drove the men out of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Most of the Viking warriors were noblemen that sought fortune in raiding. These chiefs would gather willing men and set out to raid. Such men as Rollo and Eric the Red. More about them later. The main target of the early raids would be monasteries, like the Iona Monastery, which the Vikings attacked in 795. Monasteries were rarely guarded and housed numerous jewels and riches for the Vikings to loot. Simon of Durham chronicled the plundering of the Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 in the History of the Church Durham. On the 7th of the Ides of June, they reached the Church of Lindisfarne. And there they miserably ravaged and pillaged everything. They trod the holy things under their polluted feet. They dug down the altars and plundered all the treasures of the church. The Vikings would not raid monasteries for religious reasons, but rather because they were easy targets. The focus of the Vikings in the 9th century was to raid. They attacked the Anglo-Saxon territories in the mid-9th century, such areas like Paris in 855. The biggest advantage the Vikings had was their excellent water combat, due to their advances in shipbuilding. The warships the Vikings would travel and raid with were long and narrow, allowing for much faster travel on the seas. The Vikings' ships were much faster and more agile than the opponents they would face, giving them the advantage on the seas. This advancement in shipbuilding allowed the Vikings to travel long distances in incredible speed. This advancement helped the Vikings attack and create permanent settlements in Dublin in 840 and York in 866. Also allowing Eric the Red to travel to Iceland and Greenland in 981. While on land, the chief would rally his men with a war speech and pray to Odin before charging into battle. After the initial raids in the late 9th century, the Vikings shifted their focus to settling in areas they attacked. As stated before, the Vikings created permanent settlements in Dublin and was granted land in the eastern part of the British Isles named the Danelaw. Because of this shift in focus, the Vikings began to become integrated into the European lifestyle. Many of the men converted to Christianity, including notable chief Rollo, and instead of being outsiders, they were becoming part of the European landscape. The raids were coming to an end, but the idea of ferocity and courage that made a Viking man is a reason why the expansion was so successful. The idea of strength that was expected from every male in their society, a society built on an intolerance to weakness. The Vikings prided themselves in their strength in combat. Males were the warriors of the Viking settlement, but not all males. The peasant males or yeomen were mostly farmers and artisans in the society. These men were freemen, but did not have high social ranking within the society. The social elites became warriors, trained as young boys usually by their fathers in how to fight. Because of long winters which gave way to short agricultural seasons, the Vikings had plenty of free time and would spend it competing in physical competitions, often simulating war. Wrestling was one test of strength and a way of simulating war, as grappling was a key element in their combat style. The pastime of wrestling is described in the Grettir Saga, which is the story of an Icelandic Viking. Then fell certain young men to talking how that day was fair and good, and that it were well, belike, for the young men to betake them to wrestling and merrymaking. Wrestling was a type of game young men would compete in for fun and would be a type of simulated war. This simulated war draws parallels with the analysis of the knights in Carus's book. The knights would take part in tournaments to establish the strongest of men, paralleling the same competitions the Vikings would compete in. Young men would often imitate the strong men and play with fake swords. The training young men went through to become warriors isn't truly known, but it is speculated that boys would be trained when they became the right age by their fathers. A boy must learn his worth in society, and if you were a boy of high social ranking, you were to become a warrior. Once the boys became warriors, they would join a chief to raid for fortune and fame. The chiefs were usually chosen by their strength and courage. The stronger you are, the harder the men would fight for you. Along with the pick of their soldiers, there is evidence to suggest that the strongest of men had their choice of women. The men that followed their chief were extremely loyal, willing to die for them at the drop of a hat. Everything was to be won on the battlefield, between women, riches, and fame. The way a male won these things was by the sword. If you were not strong enough to win by the sword, then you were weak, and if you were weak, that was a social death sentence for a Viking man. Their society had no sympathy for the weak. A man was supposed to protect not only the state, but his family as well. Men who were seen as weak would often not be able to own land, because the belief was a man that can't defend his homestead should not be able to have one. Also, the way you died showed if you were a man or not. Like stated before, everything was to be won by the sword, including death. The pagan Vikings believed if you died by the sword, Odin would grant you glory in Valhalla, which is the Norse version of the afterlife. It was seen as dishonorable to Odin if you were to die in any other way. So the society would see old men commit suicide because it was dishonorable to die of old age. Because of this belief, there was no sympathy for the elderly in their society. When you became old, you became weak, and when you were weak, you were less of a person. No sympathy was shown to the elderly, and sometimes would be thrown off a cliff to their death, much like they would do with sickly children. The Vikings were a society built on strength and courage, and an intolerant of weakness, and because of this, they breeded fierce warriors that shaped the medieval world. After their initial expansion came to a slow end, the remaining Vikings became valuable to the rulers of the medieval world. Vikings that did not settle in the regions became warriors for hire. The most famous of these mercenaries were the Varangian Guard. The Varangian Guard were the elite soldiers of the Byzantine Empire. Most of the men that made up the Varangians were Vikings. This mercenary group served the largest empire in the 11th century, the Byzantines. The Varangian Guard fought in Syria, Armenia, and Sicily for the Byzantines. As well as the Varangians, the Jomsvikings Vikings became a fierce mercenary group made up from Scandinavian warriors. After their initial expansion, the Vikings, because of their prowess in battle, became mercenaries to the highest bidder, and helped shape the political landscape. The long-term impact of the Viking expansion can be seen in the areas they settled. As stated before in the English Isles, after prolonged fighting, the English king allowed the Vikings to settle in the Danelaw. Unfortunately, the Vikings were pushed out of the Danelaw in the early 11th century. Because of this prolonged exposure between the Scandinavian Vikings and Anglo-Saxons, there are numerous examples of Scandinavian names and influences stay in the English Isle. Such town names as Grimsby and Thurnsby can be traced back to the Viking language. As stated before, the city of Dublin began as a Viking settlement and is now the capital of Ireland. Some words in the English language are also inspired by the Viking language, such words like husband and anger. Along with the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings also influenced other places in the European landscape, places like France. The French reached an agreement with Rollo in 911. The terms of the agreement were, Rollo would end the raids in France and convert to Christianity. In return, the French would allow them to settle in the territory of Normandy. Rollo agreed, and much like the English Isles, many different names of places and words in the French language are inspired by the Norse language. The expansion also reached the New World as Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, reached the Americas and set up a short settlement. The settlement was named the Vineland and was established in 1000 in modern-day Newfoundland. The settlement was abandoned in 1015, but Leif Erikson is now given credit for being the first person to sail to North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus would land in the Americas. The Viking saga reached all across the European nations and even to North America. The Vikings shaped the landscape of the European nations for 3 centuries. First by raiding the nearby kingdoms, then beginning to settle and become integrated into the European society. They were ruthless fighters thanks to their idea of how to be a man in the Viking society. To be a man, you needed to be strong and courageous. You needed to be a defender of the land and of your family, and if you were not a man. The Viking influence was able to stay in the places they settled until the modern day. The Viking saga not only affected the medieval world, but its influence can be seen in the modern world. Even though the Viking saga was short, their expansion became one of the most influential eras in history.